Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join our final delivery webinar. Just some housekeeping rules before we start. We will mute your audio and possibly video. This session is being recorded, as you've just heard there. You please do submit questions via the chat as we go. We'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, just put them in and we'll address them at a kind of discussion and Q&A session at the end. And the slides will be sent by email after the session. So today's agenda is a short one, so we're not going to keep you too long. We have two presentations, as I said, followed by the Q&A. The first presentation will be from myself, and we'll focus on the DeliveREE project, the aims, and the lessons learned. And the second presentation will be from Grania, and will focus on the kind of replication of the building decarbonisation model at scale. Now, just in case any of you did join the in-person conference in March, the content of the presentations from myself and Grania today will be very similar to delivered at that session. So just so you know in advance. And with that, we will kick on. So first presentation of myself, so focus on speeding up the building decarbonisation and the lessons learned from DeliveREE. First, I would like to start by introducing Kadima. We're the energy advisors to the Dublin local authorities. We're founded in 1997. It's a not-for-profit organisation, and there's 35 of us based in the digital hub now, moved from Temple Bar. We have expertise in energy planning, policy and research, public sector obligations, best practice engagement, large-scale project rollout, which myself and Grania are involved in, and project funding and facilitation as well. The DeliveREE project started back in 2021 when we applied for the last round of the Horizon 2020 project development assistance funding. The project had three main aims, and this was to create a project implementation unit sitting within Kadima, to create a delivery model that could be replicated, and to deliver 9 signed energy performance contracts. And to help us do this, we put together a partnership that consisted obviously of ourselves, Kadima, with Resourceful Futures, who are a legal and commercial consultancy based in London with a lot of experience in particularly in district heating and similar mechanisms for contractors. We had Philip Lee solicitors here based in Ireland, who were the original drafters of the EPC contract that we use, drafted on behalf of the government and SEAI at the time. We have Sustainable Development Capital Limited, or SDCL, who are private finance with offices in Dublin and in London. And then we had the 4 Dublin local authorities with projects. These were Dublin City Council, Dún Laoghaire County Council, Fingal County Council, and South Dublin County Council. And during the project, we expanded this actually to include the Mid-East county councils of Wicklow, Meath, Kildare, and Louth as well. So looking at the project in numbers, the initial target was for an investment to trigger investments of 20.4 million, and for 50% of this investment to come from the private sector, so 9.75 million. Just to be clear, I know it's kind of ambiguous the way that's written, but that's not 9.7 million investment in private sector projects, but actual 9.7 million finance or private finance invested in the public sector projects, because that was one of the kind of goals of the project development assistance to help create mechanisms that private finance could flow into these public projects. In terms of energy savings, we were looking at 24 gigawatt hours and just under 4,000 tons of CO2. So as of today, we have awarded contracts for 21 million. 2.9 million of this coming from the private sector, and we've achieved savings or potential savings of 15.5 gigawatt hours and just under 2,800 tons of CO2. Now, the initial targets were set based on 140 buildings with a broad range of kind of more lighter energy efficiency measures, but the results that we've achieved are actually based on deeper decarbonisation measures of 28 buildings. So that kind of explains the discrepancy. But we have a strong pipeline. We have another at least 25 million in the pipeline for 2026 going into 2027, bringing us up to potentially 46 million. And this would also bring us up to close to 30 gigawatt hours of energy savings and just under 6,300 tons of CO2. Um, when we developed the DeliveREE concept, we had some key project delivery issues in mind. Um, these were that project development was slow and fragmented, that this often resulted in very small project scale. With this, you had a lot of duplicated procurement, multiple procurements within a project for various different professionals required. And all of this kind of resulted in a kind of a limitation on the delivery capacity. So really the core problem, as we see it, wasn't one of ambition or finance, but it was more how projects are structured and delivered. So the DeliveREE project set out to test four key elements. These were aggregation of projects, so trying to group all the smaller projects into something bigger so they would be more attractive to the market and open it up to finance. Along with that, to standardize the whole process, so all the procedures and templates and documents, so that it became a little bit more recognizable and cut down on costs for every project. We were also looking to test contractor-led performance contracts, and also to look at projects defined by outcomes, so the energy savings, the overall CO2 savings, so rather than the technologies. We want to put in a heat pump, we want to put in solar panels. So looking at the holistic decarbonization of buildings as opposed to just putting technologies in and building up. So the clear assumption or the key assumption was that clear project structure would unlock speed, scale, and finance flexibility. A key feature of DeliveREE was that the model was tested and refined through live projects. So from previous experience in European projects, it's often common to create a model and then apply the model, and often the results they just don't match up, or the projects you were supposed to apply to model have already happened, and it gets very messy. So in this, we designed it so that the projects and the model would be all developed together. So rather than applying a fixed model at the beginning of the project and sticking to it, we use the early projects as feedback and consistently adjusted the model. So what we ended up with today is very different from what we started out with at the beginning. But through this implementation process, several lessons emerged. One of the kind of four key ones I've outlined here to kind of summarize them. But first one is around aggregation and the importance of looking at portfolio strategies using the gap to target to analyze and prioritize buildings. So, as I said earlier, when we started, we were looking at 140 buildings across the four Dublin local authorities. And our intention was that as soon as projects became ready, we just bundle them together and create the scale and aggregation that way and take them to the market. But it just didn't work. And at the same time, the focus shifted to decarbonisation, and we started to look at it through the lens of the gap to target tool provided by SEAI. And this led us to looking at each local authority individually and naturally looking at a building portfolio approach. And this proved to be a very important change in the whole concept. Related to this was lessons around communication and the value of trying to simplify decision pathways for the public authorities. So we in the early parts of the projects, we had a lot of confused conversations over when it was appropriate to use EPC and how it related to deep retrofit. And so based on all that feedback, we created some simple graphics, which I will try to clarify this or create a kind of decision pathway, which I'll show in a moment. The third lesson was really around governance. So obviously we had to ensure that the model aligned with existing public sector governance frameworks. The biggest one here is the infrastructure guidelines, which was just introduced, I think, about a year and a half, maybe 2 years into the project. So that meant a big realignment with our phasing and approach, but it really strengthened the model. And then finally, the last one was around procurement. So how we present projects to the market and the importance of balancing risk and reducing bid cost. And this was a kind of a lesson learned from the first project we brought out was with DeliveREE, and it failed towards the end of the procurement process because the way we had it structured, the bid costs were too high. And we learned from that and tried to restructure it. But that, to be honest, is still an ongoing process. We're still trying to find that ideal balance between the cost of competitive dialogue, the structure of the contract, and we're still working on that. But all in all, the final delivery model was strengthened through practical testing, iteration, and refinement. So the model is designed to be used with what we would term as decarbonisation projects as opposed to deep retrofit. So when considering when to use the model, as I said, the first step is to look at the gap to target analysis to try and prioritize buildings. And this helps to separate out deep retrofit projects from those decarbonisation. And kind of very crudely or simply, deep retrofit is kind of like a building site. Decarbonisation is working on a live building. It's not always true, but it's a kind of a crude simplification. The idea is that every building portfolio will have a small number of asset renewal or deep retrofit projects each in any one year. And these projects, while energy efficiency and decarbonisation is important, it rarely is the leading factor in them. They're a much bigger project. And for these, the traditional project development route is much more appropriate. But for all those other buildings where you're not going to shut down and decant and do a major asset renewal on, we want to decarbonise them. And those are the ones that we're proposing would go through the DeliveREE model. A core element of the model is the project implementation unit. So when it started, this project, it was just me. Now we have a team of 5 and we're recruiting one more person now at the moment. 3 of whom are working on EPC, 1 in district heating projects and 1 on residential. And what the PIU does, or at least attempts to do, is to concentrate the technical and commercial and procurement expertise. It allows the building owners to participate in this process without having to manage all the complexity of it individually and learn everything. It provides a support structure for internal staff, and it standardizes the project development and procurement process. So the promise to the market is that we'll use the same standard documents and procurement approaches for all our projects. So how does the model work? Well, in this version anyway, version 1, it is the first step is to review the building portfolio, the gap to target, and find your most significant energy users, find your asset renewal projects, separate those out, get down to your core buildings, which matter in terms of meeting your targets. So a lot of this, from a public sector perspective, is driven by meeting those initial targets. The different drivers in the private sector, but it's that idea. What are the key buildings to meet your drivers? And then once we have those buildings, we separate those into 2 groups. Basically, the large ones, the significant energy users, and everything else. It's basically applying the 80-20 rule to your buildings. And we take that significant energy user group, and for those, we have set up a framework of ESCOs or contractors. We're typically awarding here about 8-year EPC contracts, so the design, build, operate, and maintain contracts, essentially. Approximate value 5 to 10 million euro. We have a mini competition for each one of these projects using competitive dialogue. And so, for example, in the Mid-East Energy Unit, which is those Wicklow, Meath, Kildare, and Louth local authorities, we have approximately 12 buildings covered under this framework, and they're essentially the leisure centres and the large office buildings. And within those 12, we probably have four call off EPC contracts. Um, and then, but we that's the significant ones, the ones that are going to help hit the targets and make the biggest reduction. But we don't want to leave out everything else. We have a lot of libraries and fire stations and smaller office buildings that still have a, significant enough footprint. So for these, we have set up a second framework, and this operates on more of a energy guarantee model, or you could call it an EPC light, or I would describe it as a design, build, and commission. So here we're looking at 2 year guarantee period. Approximate value of these projects could be anything from 100,000 to 1.5 million. The crucial difference on this framework is this operates on a cascade system as opposed to the mini competition with the EPC. So what that means is that we have contractors ranked in positions one, two, three, that based on the results of an initial competition, which sets costs and everything for the framework. And basically, the contractor in number one position essentially gets first right of first refusal, essentially based on specific rules for each project. So it kind of really speeds up the whole procurement issue there. So, for example, in the Mid East, where we have this operating at the moment now, we have about 30 to 40 buildings covered under that framework. Um, and how that works really is if a local authority has, say, a fire station that a small or a library that they wanted to decarbonize, the first step would be get call on the framework and get a decarbonisation assessment audit completed. Now, if they have one of these already, they can skip this step. If they don't, they get the audit. This sets out the measures, the possibilities, possible savings. Based on that, they'll make some decisions, and then they might go into the second stage, which is the technical design stage. Here, the measures will be refined, costs will be refined, and following that, if everybody's happy and everything's approved, it'll go into a final detailed design and final modification, once again for sign off by the client, and then into the implementation and the measurement and verification phase. And it's during this phase, which will last 2 years, it's just in relation to the equipment installed. So it could be solar panels, heat pumps, lighting. Generally, we don't cover fabric in this because it gets, but there is a possibility for some small measures. But we're looking at monitoring KPIs such as the COP of the heat pump, the output of the PV system, savings on lighting, etc. And they're followed for 2 years. So if we look at the key elements of the model as we see it now, we have aggregation of buildings into larger project packages. So this is via the framework and grouping buildings. So the aggregation happens in two ways. So by having the framework, say for the smaller buildings, but also for the EPCs, we group um, generally 2 to 3, 4 buildings together to create scale. Um, it brings standardization, which is the standardization of the procedures and documents to try and streamline delivery. So the same procedures and contract documents are used. So, like for our initial contracts, has been a learning curve for everybody, and there's changes being made to contracts and adjustments. But as we go on, we'll be using the same templates again and again. So it's unlike, there should be smaller changes going forward. It's focused on outcome-based contracting. So performance contracts, so EPC and energy guarantee, but it's outcome-based is the key piece there rather than getting focused on the EPC element. And I think crucially, contract-led delivery. So the contractor designs, installs, and guarantees the performance. And a key structural shift in the model that we kind of learned going along was this idea of the contractor-led delivery. So the traditional model, the client designs, it's get a consultant or whatever, but you take ownership over the design. Then the contractor builds that specification, and it's generally quite consultant dependent and consultant heavy, at least in the public sector. In the delivery model, the contractor designs the solution, the contractor installs the upgrades and guarantees performance. And by contractor, if you look here, we're really talking about, this idea of the ESCO, or which could be one large company offering all these services, but more than likely it's going to be a main contractor with a group of subcontractors. So design specialists, installation specialists, and then services and maintenance specialists coming along. So it's really that's the core of what we're trying to do. We're trying to get that kind of one presentation to the client. And why is this so important? Is because it transfers the performance risk to the contractor. And what's so important about that, and what I've learned through the project, is that this really simplifies the decision making for the client, and it completely speeds up the process. Um, and I think that has been one of the main outcomes, the main learnings. So why does the system move faster? It's because speed comes from simplified decision making. So, and the key features of this are the portfolio level planning, the clear project stages, the standardized procedures and documents, defined responsibilities. We have a full RASI matrix that goes with all our project stages. And we have risk transfer, outcome focused, performance driven contracts. So all of this means that projects can move more predictably from identification through to procurement, through to contract award. And just to finish up now, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of the projects we delivered through the first framework, the kind of larger buildings, or through DeliveREE anyway. The first and largest project we delivered during the project was with South Dublin County Council, and it's a value of 9.2 million. So here, this covers 6 buildings. So the civic offices, I think the Clondalkin offices, Rural Red, the Civic Theatre, and Tala and Clondalkin leisure centres. We looked at all possible measures for decarbonisation and energy efficiency. So main ones coming out are heat pumps, BMS, LED lighting, solar PV, pump replacements, and then obviously optimization of everything. Fabric measures were considered and discussed, but they were not considered viable on a basically euro invested per ton of CO2 saved or on a payback rate. It wasn't viable. The only building where there is potential and will be addressed later is within the Tala County Hall, because there was a lot of cavity wall there. Accessing it was difficult, so we decided to delay that for now, as it was the only one, but we will readdress that. But even with that, we're looking at 878 tons of CO2 or savings per year, or a 39 to 58% reduction across individual buildings. Just under 600,000 euro of energy cost savings per year, and a 10-year contract. Then similarly in Kildare, we have a contract with a value of 4.9 million for 3 buildings. So the civic offices and the 2 leisure centres. Similar measures here. Again, looked at holistic measures, but we came out with heat pump, basically decarbonisation and optimization, heat pump, BMS, LED, solar PV, pump replacement. Fabric again was not considered. You can see in the top picture there, you can see the Oris in Kildare, and it's a lot of glass. So, replacing the fabric there is not simple, but it's also a relatively new building from a fabric perspective, similarly with the leisure centres. So they're not at that stage in their life cycle where it would justify completely updating the fabric. Yes, it will affect the performance of the heat pump, but not to a point where it can't satisfy the heat load of the building, and where it would justify actually the extra cost in the heat pump wouldn't justify the fabric upgrades. So we're looking here at 574 tons of CO2, just under 277,000 in annual energy savings, and an 8-year contract. And then the final one is the Meath leisure centres. So this was a value of 5.1 million. Two leisure centres, very similar measures as before with the other contracts. And here's 743 tons of CO2, 420,000 in savings and an 8-year contract. So this was a slightly higher capital, higher savings, but I think there was full AHU system replacement in at least one of the buildings, if not two. So coming back to the project, we're on track for 46 million with a 20.4 million original target. On track for 30 gigawatts of savings and just under 6,300 tons of CO2. And then finally, just to touch on just to give you a real example of the project development timeline. So this is from the Mid-East region. We, this is covering the 2025. In 2024, we established the framework for the EPC contract. So we had that signed in December, I think November, December 2024. And then we issued the technical file for Kildare EPC in January and the Meath one in March. And we had both contracts awarded by early December that year. And that was going through this for a first time with a lot. So a lot of people. So it can actually you can get through the process relatively quickly. And both those projects are finalizing the contracts now, and the early design is taking place. And then you can see the last one on the bottom is for the multi-party framework or the small building framework. We issued a pre-qualification of that in June, and we had it awarded by December, and that's active now. And there's a number of buildings going through that framework at the moment. So key lessons learned, final slide for myself, is that decarbonisation speed depends on delivery architecture. Decarbonisation accelerated because decision-making structures and procurement pathways and risk allocation were clarified. So to me, what DeliveREE shows is that structure enables scale, risk allocation enables investment, and simplified governance can enable speed. And that's all from me. So what we will do now, I'm not sure if there's any questions coming in, but I think we'll go straight on into Gráinne's presentation now, and then we will take some questions then at the end.
Yep, thanks, Joe. There's a question there if you want to have a look in the chat while I'm bringing up my presentation.
Okay, 1 second if I can find it. Just want to, are you able to share? Am I interpreting the numbers correctly? That the cost per CO2 is the order of 7,000. Yes, you probably are. I need to look back on those numbers myself, but they don't sound that far off. Generally, when we're looking at the cost per CO2 ton, we also do it over kind of on a life cycle basis. But yeah, we can have a chat with that after.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Is the screen come up okay there, Joe?
Yep, it is.
Perfect. So hi everyone, my name's Gráinne McNamara. So I work on Joe's team in Codima as part of our project implementation unit that was set up through the DeliveREE project. So I would have worked on some of the projects you've just heard about and continue to work on them now as they move through the next few stages. So Joe had this slide here on what the aims of the DeliveREE project were, and what I'm going to talk a bit more now is that second point there on replication, and how through the DeliveREE project we've tried to set up a system that can be replicated by other local authorities, other public sector organisations, and with a few tweaks to the model by the private sector as well. I'll just mention here again, I suppose this is very similar to the presentation I gave at the in-person conference, so just to flag that if you were there already. In terms of that replication then, I suppose where we'd suggest you'd start if you were to replicate the DeliveREE process would be using the suite of documents we've put together that we call our DeliveREE procedures and templates. So this is the RACI matrix that Joe mentioned, and we've it laid out of the about 45 different deliverables and activities that you'd be doing across 11 project stages from initiation right through to the operation and services phase of an energy performance contract. So it's set up that you can see who on your project team should be leading and supporting at each of those stages. So obviously I won't talk through each of those 45 activities today. We had a workshop about 2 weeks ago where we did go into them in a lot of detail, and there's a recording of that available. But I'm just going to touch on some of the important milestones and the broad stages. So the first stage to mention is project initiation. This is what I kind of refer to as the three A's. We're looking at project appraisal, approval, and aggregation. So I suppose what we're trying to get out of this is that pinpoint list of buildings where we're going to take action to kind of get most bang for our buck in terms of decarbonisation and meeting those 2030 targets. But in order to do that, we start kind of before that process at an organisation-wide gap to target analysis. So while we're in DeliveREE focused on building decarbonisation, the process starts earlier. It looks at things like fleet as well, so all energy and emission activities of the organisation. And you'd be doing some kind of scenario modelling to see what kind of combinations of measures in different buildings the organisation could do in order to reach those targets. I suppose the finding you'll see from the example that Joe mentioned is that generally with the local authorities, it's been the case that if you can decarbonise, the leisure centres and maybe a small number of large county hall type offices, you would be a long way towards meeting your 2030 targets. So that's been the focus. But when we do have that list of buildings, it's then a question of how do we remove gas from this building? And the answer is, a retrofit project. And then it's a conversation around, is this a deep retrofit or what we call the decarbonisation retrofit? And Joe has already touched on where we see each of them being appropriate, that a deep retrofit is very much an asset renewal project where energy is just one component of what is a much larger project. Whereas in the decarbonisation retrofit, that's where we see the delivery process becoming relevant. And here we're looking at decarbonising the plant room. It's much more mechanical and electric focused measures with maybe a small number of targeted fabric measures as required. Assuming then that the project would be looking for Pathfinder funding support, there would be a number of deliverables to prepare at this initial stage. So Pathfinder is a funding support program that's administered by SEAI, and we've gone into a good bit of detail at the last workshop we did. That's recorded and available on some of those deliverables if you wanted to hear a bit more about it. So once we have that list of buildings, then the large buildings that we're going to progress as one project, we will bring that to the market. So the procurement process that we use in the delivery model is competitive dialogue. The first stage is to issue the pre-qualification questionnaire on e-tenders. So as Joe mentioned, we would always be encouraging organisations to set up a framework that you can then draw from a number of times over a couple of years. But equally, if your organisation only has one project you're doing, it's the same process in terms of just putting out that pre-qualification questionnaire for just an individual project. So the companies then that progress and qualify from that stage, they get an invitation to participate in competitive dialogue. So we give them a pack of documents that contains a detailed technical file for each of the buildings, as well as a document that's quite important, the client requirements. So in that client requirements document, we specify what the outcomes from the project the client needs. And I suppose this is where it kind of differs from maybe a more traditional procurement approach where you're procuring pieces of equipment. In this approach, we're very much relying on the expertise and experience of the contractors or the tenderers to decide what measures they're going to propose to meet the outcomes the client has specified. So those outcomes would probably be percentage savings of carbon, and we might also specify some kind of technical guidance around things like the use of bivalent systems. Some specifying it has to be low carbon technologies you're using, and we might set some technical standards with like tenders to operate within. So the tenders then will have an opportunity to visit site, and using the information from the technical file as well, they'll put together their first proposal, their outline solutions report, and they'll present that to the project team in a competitive dialogue meeting. We'll then, ask questions, try learn about the proposal and maybe some of the alternatives that were considered. And then based on that conversation, the tenderer will go back and update their report. We'll have another meeting, discuss again, and that process can go on a couple of times. It's a kind of iterative process. And then when we get to a stage where, as the project team, we are satisfied that the outcomes in those client requirements can be met, we will then issue an invitation to submit the final tender. And then this is when tenderers will submit their final bid. So once we have those tenders back, then we will evaluate them against the evaluation criteria we would have set out. I suppose what's interesting here to note is that we don't evaluate directly against cost. We evaluate against the savings and the guarantee that the tender is offering against what we call the cost ceiling that the local authority has already set going into the project. So how we determine that ceiling, we'd use some of the figures from competitive dialogue. And in kind of recent projects, we'd be putting the ceiling at about maybe 90% of what we estimate the upfront capital expenditure of the project to be. And the assumption is then that the remaining 10% would be the private investment that the tenderer would be putting in as their stake in the project. But that's very much, I suppose, up to their own risk appetite and I suppose how much private investment they're willing to bring in order to make their bid more competitive. And the tenders will obviously be doing their own kind of financial modelling in the background to determine how they're going to recoup that investment over the life of the project, as well as making a profit. So separate to that, just to note at this stage, we do what we call a kind of value for money assessment. So this is something we're required to do in line with the infrastructure guidelines. And we're looking at a number of things here, but the figure we tend to come back to is the euro invested per tonne of CO2 saved figure. And we will look at how that compares against the shadow price of carbon that's contained in the infrastructure guidelines. I didn't actually read that question properly as it came in, but I think this might be related to the question there. So I suppose what's important is in some analysis we do, we're looking at the euro saved per a tonne of CO2, sorry, euro invested per tonne of CO2 saved annually, but we need to look at it at a life cycle because obviously the type of equipment that's going in should last for, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. So once we've kind of formalized that process and finished the evaluation, we will award the contract and enter into the standstill period. We then have a template energy performance contract that was developed through the DeliveREE project. We will provide that to the local authority or the client, and then they make the necessary kind of amendments that they need to reflect their own organisation, and they'll have their own legal review done on that contract before it will go to signing. So the next stage then to talk through is design and works. So once the contract has been awarded and the tenderer, the successful ESCO appointed, they become the project manager at this stage. So they are responsible for progressing the project, but equally, obviously, the local authority will retain a very important role in terms of providing information, providing access to buildings, and reviewing and approving all the detailed design documents. So I suppose from the tender stage, we have a preliminary design that the company was awarded based on that. But it's inevitable that as we move through detailed design, there will be aspects of that are challenged, or there was assumptions made that then have to be reviewed. So the local authority will retain an energy efficient design consultant as well as a QS to lean on throughout that process. I suppose it's hard to put a timeline on how long detailed design would be because it's very much specific to the complexity of your buildings or the number of buildings in the project. But we'd say maybe 4 to 8 months you'd be looking at for detailed design. And that process would end when the local authority has signed off on all the relevant documents. And it then moves into the works and installations phase, where the ESCO will be responsible for installing all equipment as was agreed during detailed design and in line with the schedule of works. And then the transition from that works installation phase to the services or operation and maintenance phase of the contract will happen when substantial completion has been reached across all measures of the project. And when we move into the services and maintenance phase, then that's obviously when M&V becomes central to the whole project, and that's what informs the payment mechanism that goes on for the life of the project. So I know that has been very whistle-stop tour of delivery from start to end, but just going through it at a high level and wanted to have a bit of time to mention, I suppose, some of kind of the challenges that we're seeing on the ground of these projects. So the first one Joe has actually mentioned already in terms of the bid costs for tenders to enter these projects. So I suppose I've explained what's involved in competitive dialogue, and it's a process that we see an awful lot of value in terms of being able to properly talk through solutions. But we do kind of recognise and are conscious that we have to keep bid costs reasonable for tenderers. The second point on risk perception is just related to, I suppose, working with public sector organisations. They're very much often required and instructed to use the CWMF contracts. So to be using a different one, an energy performance contract, can have a perception of risk attached to it. But I suppose hopefully you'll see from the whole structure of this that risk allocation and minimising technical risk that sits with the local authority or the client is the basis for this whole contract. So the way the structure is set up, it's allocating risk to the person on the project team who should be best equipped to manage that risk. So in this case, it's the technical risk, particularly when we're looking at heat pumps, and we're putting that technical risk back on the contractor who's designed the system and is best equipped to optimize performance over the life of the project. The third point there then obviously isn't at all specific to delivery or this process. There's just a potential for increased costs and delays when obtaining MIC increases at different sites in order to facilitate the installation of heat pumps. And then the final point there, it's a bit related to the risk perception. It's, I suppose, that people generally aren't initially familiar with the structure of an EPC and the guarantee and the shared savings. So it can understandably take a little while to come around to how that structure is going to work in practice for them. Sorry, my screen has frozen now. But that was the last slide from me anyway. And I think one last thing to ask everyone on this call to do, we're going to be quite cheeky. Our CEO, Donna, has been nominated for a European prize, the EU Women in Energy Sustainable Energy Award. And she would be the first Irish person ever to be, I think, either nominated or to win. So it would be much appreciated if you have a minute there to scan that QR code. And I think it would bring you to a link. If you put in your email, you then just have to verify it. If you could vote for her, it would be much appreciated. So I'll leave that QR code up there for just 1 second now, and then we're going to move on, I think, to a Q&A session just to finish out the webinar. So I think you can feel free to just turn on your microphone if you have any questions and jump in, or equally you can put them in the chat. I can't see if any came in here while I'm sharing my screen.
No, we don't have any extra, I don't think, at the moment. Thanks for that. Just while we're waiting, I suppose just to say this, like, this is something we've been working on a while. We are very aware that it's still a work in progress. And it's not perfect by any means. Um, well, I think we are confident we're on the right track in terms of trying to create that link between design, the installation, and the ongoing performance and maintenance of these systems. But I suppose in particular, I'd be really interested to hear from anybody in the design, contracting, installation side that's on the call. Um, you know, what your opinions are, if you feel that this is too risky, unworkable. Obviously nobody wants to take on any more risk than they have to, and I perfectly understand that. I suppose we're coming to this from representing a client side and looking at building optimization and performance and picking up issues that have often happened from poor installations. So, um, yeah, like all feedback is welcome. I suppose you don't have to come in now, but if you want to give us some feedback after, that'd be great. We're really interested in trying to improve this system and make it more attractive to everybody in the market. I suppose that's it. I see Adele, you've come on there.
I have, Joe. Well, it's super. Look, it's just fantastic, and it's great to see the movement in the market. I do have a quick question for you, if I may,
Yes, go
because
ahead.
these are although we're advancing towards net zero, actually, this is given the opportunity to look at the estate, and what we will find is, you need to invest in some resilience as well as getting the site ready for net zero. So my question to you really is, when you're calculating the cost per ton of carbon efficiency and such, do you exclude the enabling works that are required in order to deliver the energy efficiency measures? So you have a pure cost of what is needed to address some kind of backlog resilience issues and what is needed to introduce energy efficiency measures. So you're able to kind of demonstrate, I guess, how some
Yeah,
of the efficiencies released can actually fund the energy conservation measures, because the payback
yeah.
isn't always great.
The figures that we've put in today, or that you're looking at, are kind of, as I said in the chat, they're kind of an all-in cost. So we haven't had any significant enabling works to speak. The one I'm very conscious of, which will potentially be significant, that's not included in those costs, are got to do with the electrical infrastructure.
That's what
So
I was
MIC
thinking.
upgrades, stuff like that. Those ones are missing, but everything else is in those figures. So from all the professional fees to design fees to project management, any consultant you would have on a normal traditional process is that all those fees are in there. It's just the nature of how the EPC bid comes in.
Yeah. Okay.
So, like there has been a dramatic rise in costs from, we all know that, from a number of
Yeah.
years ago to now. But
But also
I,
the savings are greater because
yeah,
the tariffs have gone through the roof. So we're supporting a large saving, and I'm not certain that those tariffs are going to change in the definitely not in the near future, but over the next 5 years. So
yeah, yeah.
they are saving money. They are a spend to save in the long run. Okay. Thank you,
Thanks
Joe.
for that.
Big
Thanks for
fan, of
that.
course. Delighted to be on this
Okay.
morning. It's super. And Donna has my vote. You can let her
Right.
know. It's first
Okay.
up.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Joe, Cahal,
Carl?
got you here.
Carl?
Just a very quick, basic question. I was just wondering how receptive you were dealing with the number of local authorities there, maybe outside your own region as well, who would have been used to working with you and your methodologies. But
Hmm.
how receptive have the clients been, or has it been a hard sell, or are they, or, I could imagine there, we've done it a certain
Yeah,
way and there's a loss of control maybe a little bit. So I'm just wondering how receptive have they been?
I suppose it's mixed. And as you would expect, it does help to have a champion inside, or somebody who's on board. But I think the biggest learning was, I think so. Probably the Dublin local authorities were probably a little bit of a victim of early efforts to try and organize this, and it didn't always work. But as we got the system more improved and towards the end, and that's why I kind of showed those examples from the Mid East, we were almost able to apply it in a much more constructive way. And that was the biggest learning. Once we got the structure correct and we're confident, it really seemed to simplify the decision making. I was able to stand up in front of directors of services and say, look, we need to do this next, but it's okay because there's always an exit door. And there was always a point where you could stop without. And by the time you got deeply into it, where you were getting to the point of awarding contracts or that, everybody had been brought along on a journey. And the risk sharing part is really key to that, because you're never. I have a slide in another presentation about the idea of people in their decision making comfort zone, and any building owner making decisions on the temperature they want, the level of lighting they want, whether they want a system to be low carbon or not. That's a very simple decision, but for them to be making a decision on whether they need a 250 kilowatt heat pump or a 350 kilowatt heat pump it's an impossible decision for them. So if the idea of the structure of the contract is to put that risk onto the contractor. And that's why I was kind of interested in talking to the contractors. We don't do that at the moment. And almost this is about, to me, kind of slightly rebalancing that risk arrangement so that the people who design and install these systems stand over them, obviously not without a share in the upside. So, and I think that's the balance we're still trying to get right. So we make this attractive for all. But I think putting heat pumps into all buildings particularly focus the attention here. It's risky business.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe, we have a new question in the chat. I don't know
Chat.
if you'd see it there.
This one, how do you align the public sector targets and not increasing electricity consumption? Yeah, like the MIC issue is a huge one. We have projects where we're obviously have flexibility to increase the MIC, or we think we have. Really, we're only getting, to be perfectly honest, we're getting into that position right now. You have to move forward with it. Where we have projects where we know there are definite MIC limitations, we're actually looking at blending heat pumps potentially with other technologies like biogas boilers or whatever, or looking at options. I've seen projects in the UK where if you actually really get in and study it, the times when you go over the MIC are only particular moments during the day due to other systems operating in a building, so not allowing the heat pumps to operate at that stage. The MIC challenge, there's no point in saying anything else. It's a huge one, and the costs associated and dealing with ESP is quite difficult. From what I hear in terms of trying to the certainty. So yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, Liam, but yeah, it's something we're still dealing with.
Like on these projects, to mention though, they're all Pathfinder supported, and Pathfinder will permit up to a 90-10 split of a bivalent arrangement from heat pump to gas.
I suppose that is a good point. We have designed all of these systems as to be bivalent. They're not, well, we have 100% gas boiler backup with these heat pumps for now. It's kind of more of a transition. They're designed to operate, hopefully 100% heat pump, or at least as Ronnie said, 90% at least, and then there's conditions around that. But I think pragmatism has been the key word in all of this. It's been a very pragmatic approach. Some of our leisure centres have existing CHPs that have, still a good 8 years, 7 years left in them. We're going to keep operating them until 2030, right up until the time, because they make sense financially for the leisure centres, but not necessarily from a CO2 perspective. So it's balancing that as well. So, and that I suppose the contract, because they're multi-annual, they allow us to do that kind of planned phasing as well. But I have to say the one I'm kind of almost more excited about. The EPCs are great, whatever, but it's the multi-party, the small building framework. I think that can potentially have the biggest impact overall, because it can really speed up buildings, and those smaller buildings are more difficult to deal with. So if we can get solutions that bring the advantages of EPC without complete overcomplicating them, I think it can be quite a good one. Is there any further questions? We're almost right on time, so. Look, I think we might wrap it up there if that's it. Thank you very much for joining us and sticking with us. And I do anybody who's skeptical of all of this, and I know there always are a few. So, and I know that, as I said again, to reiterate, like we are pushing risk back onto the private sector. Please do reach out to us if you're at all curious about it and you're saying, look, I would be interested in this, but not under these conditions. Let us know. We're going to be putting out new frameworks with the local authorities in Dublin hopefully soon as well. So there will be more opportunities there. I see one last question there. Are biogas boilers considered to be full decarbonisation solution As far as I know, they are. I don't know if anybody else on the call has an opinion on that, but I looked it up recently, and biogas is considered zero carbon.
It is, yeah, it is, yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, you still have emissions. You're still burning something. You still have emissions. You still have other considerations there, and you're not going to get your energy savings, but you will get your CO2 savings. So there's lots of, it depends on whether you're in public and private then as well. Okay, we're right on time. So
Okay,
thanks very
thank
much.
you.
Sorry, thank you very
Thanks.
much. And
Thank you, guys.
yeah, we'll send on the recording after.